Same cardigan from the night before. I found the locks changed. At first I thought it was a mistake. I knocked, rang the bell. A neighbor peeked through their blinds. Sabrina opened the door a sliver. She looked rested, composed. "There's no easy way to say this," she began. "John made it clear in writing that you were to be placed in a facility if anything happened to him. He didn't want you alone here. It's unsafe." She handed me an envelope, thick, printed, clinical. "This was John's last wish. You're better off in assisted care. The house is mine now." I held that envelope for what felt like an hour, my fingers trembling not from the cold, but from betrayal. Not hers. I expected that. But the lie, the forging of love into something legal, something weaponized. Behind her, I could see Clara on the stairs, clutching her stuffed rabbit, eyes wide. She didn't wave. I walked away without a word. I didn't have a suitcase, just my purse, my ID, and a small bundle of savings I kept in a hidden drawer, and a card, a gold-embossed card I had kept tucked between the pages of an old cookbook for over 50 years, given to me by a man I barely knew, in a time long before I was anyone's mother or wife. They had taken everything from me, but they had forgotten one thing. I once saved a man's life, and he made me a promise in return. It was decades ago, in the spring of 1972, when I met him. Back then, I was just Margaret Taylor, a 22-year-old nurse in a downtown Memphis hospital. One night, a man was rushed into the emergency room, bloodied, unconscious, no identification. He'd been stabbed in an alley behind a nightclub, and judging from the panic in the EMT's voice, he wasn't just any drunk brawler. There was a tension in the air that night, unspoken, dangerous. He survived, barely. I watched over him for 3 nights straight. No visitors, no name, just a deep voice and dark eyes when he finally woke up. He said little, but on the day he left, he pressed a thick envelope into my hand. "You saved me," he said. "If you're ever in real trouble, not the kind you cry over, but the kind that eats your soul, call this number." Inside the envelope was a card, black, with embossed gold letters. No name, just a number. I almost threw it away, but something told me to keep it. Over the years, I moved on, fell in love with Walter, raised our boy, packed up the hospital memories into a box labeled "Before." That card stayed in my cookbook, untouched, like a ghost from a life I didn't speak of, until that morning on the street. I sat at the bus stop bench for hours, the rain slowly soaking through my coat, envelope in my lap, watching cars pass by without a glance. I must have looked like just another old woman who forgot her way, but I hadn't forgotten anything. I reached into my purse and pulled out the card. My hands trembled slightly as I dialed. A man's voice answered after one ring. Crisp, British. "Is this Mrs. Taylor?" "Yes," I whispered. "It's been a long time. Do you need extraction or resolution?" I didn't understand the terms, but I answered honestly. "I need to come home." There was a pause. Then, "An address?" I gave him the name of a shelter I remembered volunteering at years ago. "They'll let me in for the night." "Someone will meet you at dawn." I spent that night in a cot surrounded by coughing strangers and flickering fluorescent lights, but I slept soundly for the first time in days. Not because I had a plan, but because I had hope. At 6:01 a.m., a black SUV with no plates pulled up to the shelter's entrance. A man in a gray suit stepped out and opened the back door. "Mrs. Taylor," he nodded. "We've been expecting you." I didn't ask questions. I climbed in. They took me to a townhouse on the edge of the city, clean, discreet. There was warm food waiting, fresh clothes, and a small envelope on the table addressed to me. Inside, a note in that same tidy script. "I remember, and I repay my debts. You will have what you need, all of it. Attached to the note was a folder. It contained documents, bank statements, deeds, legal filings. The house on Maple Lane, where I had lived for over 20 years, was legally purchased under an LLC. The buyer of that LLC, me. More accurately, the man who saved me decades ago had arranged for the deed to pass to my name quietly through a back channel after Walter's death. He must have known, anticipated, watched. My name was on the ownership line, not Sabrina's, not John's, mine. There was also something else, a second folder labeled Sabrina. I opened it slowly, unsure of what I was about to see. Inside were printed screenshots, credit card statements, offshore account logs, evidence, clear and cold. Sabrina had been siphoning funds from John's accounts, rerouting savings and making quiet purchases of properties under aliases. She had, in essence, begun preparing for life without him, long before the accident. I felt my breath catch, in my throat. The betrayal was deep, but not surprising. What did surprise me was how thoroughly it had all been documented, quietly, efficiently, as though someone had been keeping watch the entire time. I asked the man in the gray suit, why? Why did he help me after all these years? He adjusted his cufflinks and said, because, ma'am, he never forgot, and neither do we. The next morning, I dressed in a navy coat that wasn't mine, but fit perfectly. There was a quiet dignity in putting on clean clothes, in brushing my hair in front of a mirror, without fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I no longer looked like a woman left behind. I looked like someone who had endured and chosen not to disappear. A driver took me back to my old neighborhood, not to confront, not yet. I needed to see it with my own eyes first. The house looked smaller now. The shutters hadn't been repainted. The lawn was overgrown. A plastic playhouse Clara once adored was now cracked. Leaning to one side like it too had given up. I watched from down the street as Sabrina opened the front door to fetch the mail, coffee in hand, silk robe flowing. Her life hadn't paused for grief. My son's death had been to her an administrative event. That afternoon, the first letter arrived at the house via courier, a formal notice of property dispute, citing the original deed now reinstated under my name. It wouldn't be the last. I did not return that day, or the next. Instead, I stayed in the townhouse provided to me, surrounded by quiet competence and silent kindness. The man who once bled on my hands had become something of a myth in certain circles, a financier, a kingmaker. I didn't know the extent of his empire, and I didn't ask. What mattered was this: I had not been forgotten. A week later, I walked into a courtroom with a lawyer who addressed me as Mrs. Taylor, with a deference I hadn't felt in years. Sabrina's expression shifted the moment she saw me, like she'd seen a ghost. She clutched her purse tightly, eyes darting to the papers laid out before her. She recognized the seals, the names. Her voice, usually sharp and confident, cracked when she whispered, "You're not supposed to be here." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. My presence was enough. That was the moment the tides turned, the moment she realized this wasn't a negotiation. It was a reckoning. I didn't want revenge. I wanted restoration, not just of property, but of dignity, of memory, of the truth. And I was just getting started. The night I called the number on that card, I sat alone at a rusted bus stop bench near the edge of our old neighborhood. The rain fell steady, soaking through my shoes, pooling around my ankles. In my purse, I had $36, my ID, and the card. That card. It was old now, edges worn, letters faded. but it still shimmered faintly under the dim streetlight. I stared at it for a long while, trying to remember what the man looked like. I couldn't. Time had blurred his face into shadow, but I remembered his eyes, cold and dark, like the Mississippi before dawn, and his voice, sharp, British, the kind you don't forget, even after 50 years. My hands trembled as I dialed. I thought maybe the number wouldn't work anymore. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe I'd wake up in the morning and laugh at myself. But then he answered. "Is it time, Mrs. Calloway?" He didn't say my first name, didn't ask who I was. He knew. Somehow, he had always known. "Yes," I whispered. "It's time." A pause. Then, "Where are you?" I gave him the address of a retirement shelter I remembered volunteering at in my 50s. I figured they wouldn't turn me away for a night. "Someone will be there by morning," he said. "Wait inside." That night was long. The shelter smelled of disinfectant and quiet despair. Most of the women there didn't speak. One offered me a cup of lukewarm tea. I sipped it gratefully. There was no shame in my presence, but there was weight. Grief sits heavy when it shares your blanket. At dawn, I stepped outside. The limousine didn't belong in this part of town. It was sleek, silent, and blacker than the wet pavement. A man in a tailored overcoat opened the rear door for me without a word. Inside, the cabin was warm. A cup of coffee rested on a silver tray. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. We drove in silence for nearly an hour, past warehouses, then past suburbs, and finally into a quiet part of the city I didn't recognize. The car pulled into a gated compound, ivy-covered walls, discreet lighting, not a single sign outside. The kind of place that didn't need to advertise because the people who needed it already knew it existed. Inside, I was welcomed with the kind of reverence usually reserved for diplomats or dying saints. A room had been prepared. Warm lighting, thick carpet, soft linens. On the nightstand, a single envelope bearing my name, Mrs. Calloway. I opened it with care. Inside were two things, a handwritten note and a silver key. The note read, "You are not forgotten. Everything you need to reclaim what is yours has already begun. This key opens the past. Use it wisely." The next morning I met with a lawyer. His name was Matthew Brigham, polished, unassuming. He wore glasses that looked too big for his face and carried a briefcase that seemed older than both of us. "I've been assigned to represent your interests, ma'am," he said. "Your full estate has been reinstated. The house, the pension, even the trust fund John never knew you had. All of it is under your name again." "My name?" I whispered. "Yes," he nodded. "And Sabrina. She'll be notified today." I didn't ask how. I didn't need to know how many strings had been pulled or who pulled them. Some debts, once promised, don't expire with time. That afternoon, Sabrina received the first envelope, a formal notice of estate reassignment and revocation of occupancy. Later that evening, the second envelope arrived, this one from the county courthouse, a summons. She didn't call me, but I knew she'd be furious. I imagined her pacing the living room, dialing lawyers, yelling into the phone that something wasn't right, that this must be a mistake. But it wasn't. The deed had always had a shadow clause, a stipulation placed quietly in a document decades old, buried behind layers of corporate names. Walter never knew. John never knew. But someone had ensured it would activate under one condition: if I, Margaret Calloway, was ever removed from that home by force. And that had just happened. 3 days later, I returned to the house. This time, not as a guest. Sabrina was waiting on the front porch, arms crossed, trembling in her silk robe. "You can't just walk back in here," she snapped. You can't take everything. It's mine now." "No," I said quietly, stepping past her. "It never was." I unlocked the door with the silver key. It turned smoothly, like it had been waiting all these years. Clara peeked from behind the living room curtain. Her eyes met mine. No fear, just confusion, and something else, relief. The house felt different, not because anything had changed, but because I had. In the following days, lawyers and court dates followed, but it was already done. The documents were airtight. The surveillance of Sabrina's financial misconduct had been meticulous. Records of wire transfers, overseas accounts, fraudulent signatures. She didn't fight for long. When the judge read the final ruling, Sabrina didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just sat there, her posture collapsing slowly, like someone finally understanding the cost of a lie held too long. She was ordered to vacate within 10 days. The estate was returned fully to me. Clara was placed in temporary custody with her maternal aunt, while the courts reviewed guardianship. I had not asked for that, but Sabrina had pushed too far, too fast, and now the world was pushing back. One evening, as I sat on the back porch with a cup of tea, Clara appeared at the edge of the yard, her little backpack sagging behind her. Her aunt must have told her where I lived now. I rose slowly, unsure whether to approach or wait. She walked up the steps herself. "Grandma," she said softly, "can I stay with you tonight?" Tears welled up in my eyes, but I held them back. "Of course, sweetheart. You never needed to ask." That night I tucked her into the same bed John once slept in as a boy. She curled into the blanket, whispering, "Mom says you're dangerous." I knelt beside her. "Do you think I am?" She shook her head. "I think you're brave." The next day I filed for guardianship. Clara needed stability. She needed truth. And she needed someone who wouldn't weaponize love as a tool for control. The court reviewed everything: the bank fraud, the neglect, even statements from neighbors who had noticed Sabrina's coldness. It didn't take long for them to decide. I was granted permanent guardianship. Clara came home for good. But that wasn't the end. A week after the ruling, I received a final envelope from the townhouse compound. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper. Debt fulfilled. Should you ever need to disappear, one last time, you know how to find me. It was unsigned, but I didn't need a signature. Some stories don't end with revenge. They end with reclamation. I stood on the front porch of my house, no longer theirs, only mine, and watched Clara play with sidewalk chalk. For the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. Let them think I'm just an old widow. They have no idea who I've been, and they'll never know who I still could be. In the weeks following the court's decision, things moved quickly. Sabrina vacated the house, but not before the full extent of her misdeeds came to light. Hidden purchases, designer bags, luxury trips, boutique furnishings, had all been charged to accounts she had opened under my name. I hadn't even known she had access to those, but the paper trail was damning. She had borrowed heavily against my supposed credit, forged co-signatures, and routed the bills through John's name while blaming rising expenses. When the judge saw the evidence, the ruling was swift. Not only did she lose the house, she was held financially liable for restitution. Her real estate license was suspended pending investigation. She had built her image on illusion, and illusions don't survive scrutiny. Meanwhile, Clara settled in quietly. There were nights when she cried for her father, and mornings when she barely spoke. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. But we planted a rose bush together on the side of the house, and she chose the color, deep crimson, just like the ones John used to bring home for my birthday. It became our ritual, watering the roses before breakfast. One Saturday afternoon, as we were making lemon scones in the kitchen, Clara paused and looked at me. "Grandma," she asked, "how did you get all this back? The house, the money, everything?" I looked at her small face, so full of the kind of curiosity that reminded me of John at that age. I smiled gently, brushing flour off her cheek. "Sometimes," I said, "kindness returns in forms we never expect." She didn't press. She simply nodded, as if some part of her understood that the world was wider and deeper than she knew, and that I had walked paths no child needed to see just yet. A month later, I sat down at the dining table, one John had helped Walter build many years ago, and began drafting the foundation documents. It was time. I named it the John Calloway Fund for Aspiring Engineers. The mission was simple: to provide scholarships and mentorship for orphans and underprivileged children who wanted to study engineering. It was a field John had loved deeply. He used to say, "Mom, the best feeling in the world is fixing something everyone else said was broken." I wanted to carry that spirit forward, not in his name only, but in his legacy. Within 2 weeks, I had the paperwork filed. A modest seed fund was set aside, part from the restored estate, part from a wire transfer I received without sender's name or note. But I knew where it came from. The foundation received more applications in its first month than I had expected. Schools reached out. Local firms offered to provide internships. It became more than I had dreamed, because it had been built from grief, but not from bitterness. Soon after, I sold the house, not out of spite or sorrow, but because it belonged to a chapter I had already closed. Clara and I moved to a small cottage by the sea. It was quiet, with a garden full of wild roses and ocean mist in the morning air. I painted the shutters blue. We hung wind chimes on the porch. And sometimes I would sit in the rocking chair, watching the waves with a peace I hadn't known in decades. Then one evening, just before sunset, a black town car pulled into the gravel driveway. He stepped out slowly, older now, of course, but unmistakable. The same eyes, the same poise. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. "I thought I'd come for tea," he said with a smile. I led him to the back patio, where the sea met the sky in soft orange haze. We sat in silence for a while, sipping quietly. After a time, he said simply, "I never forgot what you did." I nodded, my hand trembling only slightly. "And I never forgot what you gave me in return." He glanced toward the garden where Clara was drawing chalk figures on stone. "I hope the world never forgets women like you." We didn't speak much after that. There was no need. Some debts are paid in silence, with a glance, with the peace of a shared sunset. When he left, I stood by the fence, watching the car disappear down the coastal road. The wind carried the sound of chimes behind me. Inside the cottage, a pot of tea still steamed on the table. Clara looked up and asked, "Who was that man?" I smiled. "Someone who owed me a favor and kept his word." That night, after Clara went to bed, I sat alone on the porch with a worn leather journal in my lap. It was one I hadn't opened in years, filled with recipes, notes from Walter, and old pressed flowers from places we'd once visited. I wrote a final entry. To grow old with dignity is a quiet rebellion. To rise again after betrayal, a quieter triumph still. I didn't need recognition. I didn't need applause. What I had now was something more lasting. Peace earned, not given. Dignity restored, not requested. In the mornings, Clara and I would walk down to the beach, collecting shells and naming them after constellations. I taught her to bake, to sew, and one day I would teach her to stand tall, even when the world tried to shrink her. Sometimes the wind would blow in from the east, salty and strong, and I would close my eyes and breathe deeply, not out of sadness but gratitude. Not everyone gets a second beginning. One morning, as we walked along the shore, Clara looked up at me and asked, "Grandma, are you happy now?" I paused. The sky was wide open, the ocean calm. "Yes," I said, "I am, but not because everything turned out fair. I'm happy because I remembered who I was before they made me forget. That is the story, really, not of revenge or wealth or cleverness, but of memory, of a woman who remembered her worth and chose, at last, to live like it. They say time heals all wounds, but I've learned it doesn't. Not really. Time can dull the ache, yes. It can soften the edges of grief. But some wounds become part of your skin, woven into who you are, and if you're lucky, they become your armor, not your prison. For a long time, I thought my story had ended the night John died, that I had served my purpose as a wife, a mother, a caretaker, and that what remained of me was just a shadow trailing behind younger generations. But I was wrong. It wasn't the end. It was a beginning I hadn't seen coming. They pushed me out because they thought I had nothing left to offer. They underestimated the quiet power of a life lived in full. They mistook silence for weakness and grace for surrender. And now, as I sit here, near the sea, with my granddaughter sleeping peacefully in the next room and the stars brushing their light across our windows, I realize something else. They gave me a gift. When they took everything, I was free to remember who I truly was. I am not just someone's mother or someone's widow or a woman forgotten. I am Margaret Calloway, and I am still here. I have weathered loss. I have endured betrayal. I have risen with dignity, and I have done it without hatred, without shouting, without breaking. Instead, I built something better, a home filled with peace, a foundation that carries my son's legacy forward, a future for a girl who will grow up knowing that strength doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers. When Clara asks me questions about the past, about her father, about what happened, I tell her the truth, but gently. Not every story needs all the scars on display. I tell her about the kind of man John was, the kind of laughter he brought into a room, the way he always stopped to fix broken things, even if no one asked. And when she asks about the dark parts, the betrayal, the loneliness, I remind her that people sometimes lose their way when they fear losing control, that love, when wielded as a weapon, leaves wounds on everyone. But more importantly, I teach her what survival looks like. It looks like planting roses where someone tried to salt the earth. It looks like keeping your voice steady in a courtroom full of liars. It looks like remembering that you are allowed to begin again, no matter how late the hour. Sometimes, late at night, I walk outside and sit by the sea. The waves come in, unbothered and unhurried, like they've been doing long before us and will long after we're gone. And in their rhythm, I hear something familiar. You are enough. You have always been enough. They just didn't see it. But I see it now. And because I do, Clara will grow up seeing it too, in herself, in others, and in the legacy of quiet strength passed down through hands that held on even when the world let go. I hope that when she's older and life tests her, she'll remember this time, not as the moment her family broke, but as the moment her grandmother stood up and became whole again. That will be my final gift to her. That will be the story worth telling.